The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at Fort Benedict Military Base, a sprawling compound just outside Millbrook, Kansas, a town so small that most highway travelers blinked past it without noticing. It was March 2015, and the base was alive with the controlled chaos of a Tuesday morning. Trucks rumbled, boots echoed, orders barked. Captain Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the flight line, watching the transport helicopter prepare for departure. At 32 years old, she had the kind of presence that made people do a double take, not because she was soft or delicate, but because she carried herself like someone who had earned her place in a room where few women had ventured before. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight military bun. Her uniform hung perfectly pressed, every crease sharp as a knife blade. But her eyes told a different story. Those eyes had seen things that didn't appear in official reports. Sarah had been a military intelligence officer for 11 years. She had served 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. She had decoded enemy communications, translated intercepted documents, and contributed to operations that saved lives. Her service record was spotless. Her evaluations were excellent. And yet, as she walked through the corridors of Fort Benedict, she felt the weight of something heavier than duty. She felt the weight of disbelief. "Captain Chen?" a voice called out behind her. It was Major Tom Brennan, the base operations officer. He was in his mid-50s, with silver threading through his military regulation haircut and the kind of belly that came from too many years of desk work and not enough exercise. He had a reputation at the base, not a good one, at least not among the women who worked there. Sarah turned around. She was trained to remain calm, to present a professional face no matter what was happening inside her. "Sir." "Just wanted to say goodbye before you head out," Brennan said, falling into step beside her. "Shame you're leaving us. The base won't be the same without our resident conspiracy theorist." He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. Sarah kept walking. She had heard this before, worse versions of it. Versions spoken in locker rooms and break rooms where people thought women didn't listen or didn't care. "I'm conducting follow-up interviews with civilian contractors in the region, sir. Standard intelligence gathering." Sure, Brennan said, nodding with exaggerated understanding. "Though between you and me, I wouldn't put too much stock in those stories you've been collecting. You know how civilian contractors are. They get paid to talk. They make things up to seem important." He paused, then added with a chuckle, "Besides, a woman in a war zone. Come on, Chen. You know that's not really their typical environment." Sarah felt the familiar flame of anger kindle in her chest, but she had learned long ago not to let it show. Anger was what they wanted. Anger made you careless. Anger made them win. "I'll keep that in mind, sir," she said, her voice level and professional. She didn't tell Brennan what she actually believed. She didn't tell him about the 3 soldiers she had interviewed over the past 6 months. She didn't tell him about the patterns she had uncovered. She didn't tell him about the photographs that had been smuggled out by a former detainee who still had contacts in the region. She didn't tell him any of it, because she had learned that in the military, sometimes the truth was a dangerous thing for a woman to carry alone. Sarah had first joined the Army at 21 years old. Her parents, both first-generation Chinese immigrants who had built a successful restaurant business in San Francisco, had wanted her to go to college and become a doctor or a lawyer, something respectable and safe. But Sarah had always felt the pull of something larger than herself. She had felt the pull of service. When she graduated from basic training, she was the only woman in her unit. When she qualified for intelligence training, her commanding officer had told her she was taking a man's spot. When she got her first assignment in Baghdad, her roommate in the quarters had asked her, not unkindly but genuinely puzzled, why she would want to put herself in danger when she could be doing something else. Sarah had never had a good answer to that question, not one that satisfied anyone anyway, so she had stopped trying to explain and just focused on doing the work. She had become very good at what she did. Too good, maybe. Because good work sometimes made people uncomfortable, especially people who had things to hide. The helicopter was idling on the tarmac, rotors cutting through the air in their hypnotic rhythm. Sarah climbed inside, found a seat, and strapped herself in. She had a folder full of interview transcripts, maps with locations marked, and a list of names. Most of the people she worked with thought she was chasing ghosts. They thought a woman captain was letting her emotions get in the way of her judgment. They thought she was paranoid. But Sarah had spent 3 weeks in captivity. That was the thing nobody wanted to acknowledge. The thing that, in their minds, disqualified her from being rational about anything related to prisoners of war or detention camps. It had happened in 2009 during her first tour. A supply convoy had been ambushed. Sarah had been traveling with intelligence personnel to meet with an asset in a village 20 kilometers outside Baghdad. The attack had been swift and brutal, coordinated, professional. Within minutes, 2 soldiers were dead, 3 were wounded, and Sarah was being dragged out of an overturned truck by men shouting in Arabic. She spent 21 days in a house somewhere in the countryside. She never knew exactly where. She was kept in a basement room with a single small window that faced a brick wall. The first few days, the men who held her had asked her questions: who she worked for, what she knew, what security protocols she had information about. Sarah had given them her name, rank, and serial number. She had refused to answer anything else. They had not tortured her, which she later learned was because someone higher up in the chain had ordered them not to. Apparently, even in the depths of war and captivity, there were rules. Unspoken ones, but rules nonetheless. What they had done instead was something more insidious. They had fed her. 3 times a day, a young man, couldn't have been more than 23 or 24, had brought her a tray of food. The meals were simple but filling: rice, flatbread, sometimes chicken, always with water, lots of water. And on the 7th day, they had brought her a Coca-Cola. Sarah still remembered the shock of it, the ice-cold bottle sweating in the Mesopotamian heat, the taste of the familiar drink, so out of place in that dark room. It had made her cry, which had surprised her almost as much as it had surprised the guard who had brought it. He had looked confused, as if he couldn't understand why cold, sugary water would trigger an emotional response in a grown woman in military captivity. But Sarah understood. The Coca-Cola wasn't really about the drink. It was about home. It was about all the Friday nights her parents had taken her to the drive-in when she was a kid, before the drive-in closed down. It was about the ordinary magic of being American, of having access to things most of the rest of the world considered luxuries. And having that taken away made it clear exactly what was at stake. On the 21st day, a U.S. Special Forces team had raided the compound. They had come in fast and hard, and it had taken Sarah's brain several seconds to process that they were American, that they were there to get her out. She had been flown to a field hospital, cleared by a doctor, debriefed by military intelligence, and this was the part that had shocked her more than anything else. She had been told that her experience had been somewhat unusual because, in the opinion of her commanding officers, her captors had treated her better than they usually treated prisoners. "You're one of the lucky ones," the debriefing officer had told her. His name was Colonel Harris, and he had the satisfied expression of someone who thought he was being kind. "No permanent injuries, no lasting trauma as far as we can assess. You've got a good story, but try not to dwell on it too much. Move forward, Captain. That's the military way. Move forward, don't dwell. Don't think about the sounds of the other detainees that sometimes echoed down the hallway when the wind was a certain direction. Don't think about what might have happened if that Special Forces team had arrived a day later. Don't think about the fact that nobody had explained to her, then or now, why her captors had been so restrained. Why a woman soldier, a prize asset, had been protected rather than exploited. Don't think, just move forward." Sarah had tried. She had returned to her duties. She had completed her tour. She had gotten promoted. She had volunteered for another tour. And then, in 2013, she had been talking to a colleague at a conference in Washington, D.C., and that colleague had mentioned something that changed everything. The colleague, a fellow officer named Captain Marcus Webb, had been working on a project tracking the movements of a particular al-Qaeda-connected cell. His team had been analyzing prisoner reports and intercepts, and they had noticed something odd. A woman had been held by this cell in 2009. American, military. The circumstances of her capture and release had been unusual enough to stick in people's minds. "Do you know who it was?" Marcus had asked her without any real expectation that she would. Sarah had heard her own voice, as if from very far away, say the words, "That was me." Marcus had gone very pale, and then he had told her something that nobody at Fort Benedict was willing to say. He told her that the cell that had held her had, 3 years later, been connected to a terrorist attack in Kabul that had killed 14 people, including 8 Americans. The cell had received funding and coordination support that had been traced, at least partially, back to a private defense contractor named Blackridge Solutions. And Blackridge Solutions, Marcus had explained in a careful, quiet voice, had a security consultant who used to work in military liaison, a man named Lieutenant Colonel James Hartley, who had been stationed at Fort Benedict in 2009. Sarah had done the research on her own time, using every resource she could access without triggering security alerts. What she had found had made her blood go cold. Hartley, now retired and working full-time for Blackridge, had been in communications with the cell leader during the time Sarah was held. Casual communications disguised in routing reports and asset updates, but they were there if you knew how to read them. And most of all, Hartley had been the one to give the order that Sarah not be harmed. Hartley had been the one who had pushed for her release, who had made sure that she was treated with a restraint that was completely at odds with how other prisoners had been handled. Why, that was the question that kept Sarah awake at night. Why would a U.S. military officer be protecting her while communicating with the very people holding her? What was the connection? It had taken another year of careful investigation, of interviews conducted off the books, of using her security clearance in ways that technically might not have been authorized. But gradually, a picture had emerged. A terrible, complex, heartbreaking picture. Hartley and the cell leader had been working together on something. A weapons smuggling operation, a way to get certain military technology into the hands of people who could afford to pay for it. The cell leader hadn't wanted Hartley's involvement in the operation to be discovered, but there was always risk, always the possibility that someone would stumble onto the truth. So Hartley had suggested they use Sarah as insurance. They would capture her. They would treat her well. They would make sure she survived. And then when the time came, they would release her and she would feel grateful. She would feel like she had been treated decently by her captors. And if anyone ever questioned why her captivity had been such an anomaly, why she hadn't been abused or broken or killed, she would be a walking testimonial to the fact that her captors were, fundamentally, good people. Civilized people. People worth doing business with. They had used her. Without her knowledge or consent, they had used her story as a character reference. And nobody had believed her when she tried to tell them about it. The helicopter roared to life beneath her. Sarah gripped the armrests and stared out the small porthole window as Fort Benedict fell away below her. Somewhere down there, Major Brennan was probably back in his air-conditioned office, already forgetting that she had existed. Somewhere down there, the paperwork for her voluntary reassignment was being processed. Somewhere down there, people were having conversations about the unbalanced female captain who had gotten it into her head that there was some grand conspiracy. But Sarah had learned something in those 21 days of captivity, something that no amount of military training could teach. She had learned that sometimes, the only person who could fight for the truth was someone with nothing left to lose, and that maybe, just maybe, her discharge from Fort Benedict wasn't the end of her story. Maybe it was the beginning of something else entirely. She pulled out her phone, turned off airplane mode as they reached cruising altitude, and opened her secure email. She had been in contact with a few people outside the military structure. An investigative journalist from the Washington Post named Linda Vasquez, a former FBI agent named Robert Chen, no relation, though she had discovered they both had family roots in the same province in Taiwan. A congressman's aide who had become concerned when Sarah had submitted an official complaint through the chain of command that had been summarily dismissed. They had all told her the same thing. The evidence would need to be airtight. The connections would need to be undeniable, and most of all, she would need to be prepared for the backlash, because powerful people did not appreciate having their secrets exposed. Hartley had money, connections, and a reputation as a security expert. Blackridge Solutions had government contracts, and Sarah had a discharge letter that was already being typed up, stamped with her failure. But Sarah had also had 3 weeks to think about all the things that Hartley's operation might have prevented if it had been stopped in time. She thought about the 14 dead in Kabul. She thought about the weapons that her tax dollars might have helped create, that had been sold to people who used them to kill Americans and Afghan civilians. She thought about all the other prisoners who hadn't been as lucky as she had been, whose captivity had been brutal because they weren't valuable insurance policies. She pulled up her email and began to compose a message to Linda Vasquez. The helicopter engines roared around her, carrying her toward Millbrook, Kansas, toward a small apartment above the hardware store on Main Street, toward the life of a civilian that she was about to be forced into. Millbrook, Kansas sat in the rolling hills of northeastern Kansas like a secret that the modern world had forgotten to discover. The town had a population of just under 8,000 people, which meant that almost everyone knew almost everyone else, and everyone knew everyone else's business. The main street consisted of the hardware store, a diner called the Golden Plate, a bank, a grocery store, a doctor's office, and a video rental place that had somehow, miraculously, survived the streaming revolution by having the good sense to also rent video games and offer really cheap pizza. Above the hardware store, in a modest two-bedroom apartment that her parents had helped her rent sight unseen, Sarah Chen sat at a kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold in front of her and tried to understand what her life had become. The official story was that she had been medically discharged. The details were vague, which was how the military liked it. Nobody wanted to admit that a female officer had been deemed too emotionally compromised to continue serving. Nobody wanted to put into words the fact that she had filed complaints about a superior officer, and those complaints had been deemed lacking in credible evidence. Nobody wanted to acknowledge that she had become a problem for the chain of command, and the solution was to make her go away. Her father had called her 3 times in the first week after she arrived in Millbrook. He had never said the words, "I told you so," but Sarah could hear them echoing beneath his careful questions about how she was settling in. Her mother had been more direct. "You should have taken the college route," her mother had said, not unkindly. "The Army doesn't appreciate women the way you thought it would. Now you come home to California, your father can give you a job at the restaurant." But Sarah wasn't ready to go home. Going home would mean admitting defeat. It would mean accepting that her career was over, that her evidence was worthless, that Hartley and Blackridge Solutions would walk free and continue their operations. So instead, she had moved to Millbrook, a town her grandmother had been born in before immigration had scattered the family across the country. She had taken a job at the public library, working part-time, processing returns, and helping elderly patrons figure out how to use the computers. The pay was barely enough to cover rent, but she had her military pension, modest as it was, and she had something more valuable, time. On her 5th day in Millbrook, Sarah walked into the Golden Plate Diner for breakfast. The diner was exactly what you would expect a small-town Kansas diner to be. Checkerboard floor, red vinyl booths with chrome accents, a counter with spinning stools. Behind the counter, a coffee maker that ran in almost permanent cycles, and a chalkboard menu that featured meat loaf, fried chicken, and something called the breakfast bonanza that appeared to involve 3 eggs, 6 strips of bacon, and a hash brown that could have sustained a small family. The woman behind the counter was in her mid-60s, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a short, practical style, and the kind of warm but no-nonsense expression that came from years of dealing with hungry customers. She looked up from the coffee pot she was refilling and gave Sarah an appraising look. "First time in here?" the woman asked. "Yes," Sarah said, sliding into a booth by the window. "I'm new to town, moved into the apartment above Henderson's Hardware." The woman's eyes lit up with recognition and interest. In a small town, a new resident was something noteworthy. "Henderson's place? That's been sitting empty for 6 months. I'm Betty Marino. I own this place." She came over with a menu and a coffee cup, pouring before Sarah had even agreed to coffee. "What's your story? Not many people move to Millbrook. Usually they're trying to move away from it." Sarah appreciated the directness. "I'm taking a break from the military, thinking about figuring out what comes next." Something flickered across Betty's face, recognition maybe or understanding. "Military," she repeated. She nodded slowly. "My son was military, Marine, got out 5 years ago. It's a different world, isn't it? Leaving it behind, I mean." "You could say that," Sarah said carefully. Betty studied her for another moment, then seemed to come to some kind of conclusion. "Well, you've come to the right place if you're looking for quiet. Millbrook doesn't have much excitement, but what it does have is good people and good pie. My pecan pie won a ribbon at the Kansas State Fair 2 years running." She gestured with the coffee pot. "What can I get you?" Sarah ordered eggs over easy, bacon, and wheat toast. While she waited for the food, she looked around the diner. There were perhaps a dozen other customers, scattered throughout the booths and the counter. A couple of elderly men in the back, probably retired farmers, having a quiet conversation over coffee. A middle-aged woman in a pantsuit that suggested she had a job in one of the county offices. 3 teenagers who should probably have been in school. And then there was the man at the counter. Sarah didn't notice him at first, not really. He was just a man, maybe mid-40s, with graying temples and the kind of weathered look that came from working outside. He was eating eggs and toast, reading a physical newspaper, and not paying any attention to anyone around him. But then Betty brought Sarah's food and set it down in front of her, and the man glanced up, and their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Sarah felt something shift. Not attraction exactly, though the man was attractive in a quiet way. It was more like recognition. The man had the bearing of someone who had served. There was something in the way he held himself, the way he sat, that spoke of discipline and routine. But then he looked back down at his newspaper, and the moment passed. Sarah ate her breakfast slowly, trying not to think about why a stranger's eyes had triggered that kind of response in her. She was jumpy. That was all. Hypervigilant. A side effect of her discharge process and the stress of the last year of her life. She was finishing her coffee when Betty came back over. "That's Jack Mueller," Betty said quietly, not bothering to be subtle about where she was gesturing. "He runs the hardware store, lost his wife about 8 years ago, never remarried, keeps to himself mostly, but he's decent, a good neighbor." "I didn't ask," Sarah said, but she was smiling a little. "I know," Betty said, "but he's one of the good ones, and good men are hard to come by, especially if you're looking for someone who's going to understand what it means to come back from something difficult." Betty paused, then added, "He did 2 tours in the Gulf, Army Engineer Corps, came back a changed man from what people say. Took him a few years to settle down, but he did." Sarah nodded, filed away the information, and left a tip on the table. She had a shift at the library that afternoon, and she wanted to stop by the hardware store first. Not because Jack Mueller worked there, she told herself that firmly, but because she needed to pick up some supplies for her apartment. The hardware store was a classic small-town establishment, with narrow aisles packed with everything from nails to paint to power tools. It smelled like sawdust and metal and the particular chemical scent of solvents and cleaners. The man behind the counter looked up from a ledger when she came in. It was the same man from the diner, and yes, he was definitely ex-military. Everything about him screamed it. "Help you find anything?" he asked, his voice pleasant but not particularly warm. "Just looking for some hooks," Sarah said. "The heavy-duty kind. My apartment needs some shelving solutions." Jack led her to the relevant section and then retreated, respecting her space in a way that suggested he understood not everyone wanted to be chatted up in a hardware store. Sarah took her time selecting what she needed. She got the hooks, some wood for shelves, and some other small supplies. When she came back to the counter, Jack rang everything up without much conversation, but as he was putting her items in a bag, he said quietly, "Betty talks about everyone in town. Don't hold it against her." "She means well." Sarah felt her face get warm. "I didn't think." "I know you didn't," Jack said. He handed her the bag. "Welcome to Millbrook. It's a good town, even if it takes some time to get used to." "Thank you," Sarah said. And that was the beginning of something she didn't quite know how to name yet. Not friendship, because they barely knew each other. Not anything romantic, because Sarah had too many other things on her mind. But a kind of quiet acknowledgement that sometimes, when 2 people from the same strange world ended up in the same small town, they recognized something in each other that nobody else could quite see. That evening, Sarah set up the shelving in her apartment. She mounted the new hooks carefully, making sure everything was level and secure. It was the kind of task that required focus and attention to detail, which meant that for a few hours, she wasn't thinking about Hartley or Blackridge solutions, or the evidence she still hadn't quite figured out how to assemble into something that would make powerful people take her seriously. She was just Sarah Chen, a woman in a small Kansas town, hanging shelves in an apartment above a hardware store. Over the next few weeks, a routine began to establish itself. Sarah would work her shifts at the library, helping Mrs. Patterson find large print mysteries, showing Mr. Okonkwo how to use email, listening to the teenagers complain about their assigned reading. She would go to the Golden Plate for breakfast most mornings, where Betty would brief her on the town's happenings with the efficiency of a military briefing officer. And occasionally, she would need something from the hardware store, and she would run into Jack, and they would have brief, quiet conversations about building supplies or the weather or whether the Kansas City Royals had any hope this season. It was a simple life, a small life, a life that most of the people who had known Sarah at Fort Benedict would have considered beneath her capabilities, and yet in some ways it was exactly what she needed. But on a Tuesday in April, the simplicity of that life was disrupted. Sarah received a phone call from Linda Vasquez, the Washington Post journalist she had been communicating with. "I want to do the story," Linda said without preamble. "But I need more documentation. Can you meet with me? In person. I want to look you in the eye while we talk about this, so I know you're not crazy." Sarah's heart had begun to race. She had been waiting for this moment for months, and now that it was here, she found herself terrified. "When?" Sarah asked. "2 weeks," Linda said. "There's a hotel in Topeka. We can meet there. Neutral ground. Bring everything you have." After Linda hung up, Sarah sat in her apartment for a long time, staring at her hands. In 2 weeks, she would either start down the path to exposing a criminal conspiracy, or she would be publicly humiliated as a delusional former officer with an axe to grind. There was no middle ground, and there was no way she could do this alone. Sarah picked up her phone and typed out a message to Jack Mueller. She asked if he wanted to grab dinner sometime. A real dinner, not just a chance meeting in the diner. She wasn't sure why she was asking him. She wasn't even sure she was ready for whatever it was she seemed to be inviting into her life. But she sent the message anyway. And to her surprise, Jack replied almost immediately. He suggested a restaurant about 30 miles away in a larger town, somewhere private where they wouldn't run into half the population of Millbrook. Friday night if she was free. Sarah replied yes, and then she sat in her apartment in the growing darkness of the Kansas evening and tried to calm her racing heart. Everything was about to change. The question was whether it would change for better or worse. The restaurant was called Marcello's, and it occupied a converted Victorian house about 40 miles south of Millbrook, in a town large enough to have culture but small enough to not feel overwhelming. Cream-colored columns graced the front porch. Soft lighting glowed from the windows. The kind of place people took dates they were trying to impress, or where they had important conversations they didn't want overheard. Sarah dressed carefully in the one pair of decent jeans she owned and a dark blue sweater. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back at her. When had she stopped being Captain Chen of the U.S. military and become just Sarah, a woman on her first real date since her discharge? Jack picked her up at 7. He had cleaned up from his hardware store clothes. He wore dark slacks and a button-down shirt, and he had gotten a recent haircut. He looked nervous, which Sarah found oddly comforting. She wasn't the only one who wasn't sure what they were doing here. The drive to Marcello's took about 45 minutes. They made small talk at first. Jack told her about the hardware store, about how his father had owned it before him, about how he had wanted to be an engineer but had come back to Millbrook after his military service and just never left. Sarah told him about growing up with parents who owned a restaurant, about how she had always felt the pull toward something bigger than the family business. As they drove, the conversation gradually deepened. Jack told her about his wife, about how she had been a teacher, about how she had died of cancer 6 years ago. He corrected his earlier comment to Betty. Sarah didn't know why he was telling her these things, except that sometimes, when you met another person who understood loss, you couldn't help but share. By the time they arrived at Marcello's, Sarah found that she had relaxed enough to actually enjoy being there. They were seated at a small table by a window that overlooked a garden. A waiter brought wine without them having to ask. The restaurant apparently operated on the assumption that anyone who came here wanted wine. The menu was in Italian, but the restaurant clearly anticipated that not all their customers were fluent, because there were descriptions in English underneath. "I have to tell you something," Sarah said after they had ordered. She had decided in the car that she wasn't going to waste time on games or pretense. "I'm not exactly who you probably think I am." Jack smiled. "I'm pretty sure I know exactly who you are. You're a woman who was brave enough to join the military and strong enough to keep going when things got hard. Beyond that, I'm still learning, but I don't think I'm wrong about the basics." "I was held prisoner," Sarah said. The words came out before she had quite decided to say them. "During my first tour in Iraq for 3 weeks, and nobody at the base believed that what happened to me was unusual. They thought it was just one of those things, a story to tell but not something to worry about." Jack listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer platitudes or false sympathy. He just listened, and Sarah found that she kept talking. She told him about the Coca-Cola. She told him about the young guard who had looked confused when she cried. She told him about the Special Forces rescue and the debriefing afterward. She told him about the investigation she had started, about the connections she had found between her captors and a corrupt military officer. She told him about how nobody had believed her, how her complaints had been dismissed, how she had been forced out rather than having her concerns taken seriously. By the time she finished, their food had arrived and was growing cold. Jack reached across the table and took her hand. "I believe you," he said simply. "I don't know all the details and I don't know all the people involved, but I believe you, and I know what it's like to not be believed about something important. After I got back from the first Gulf tour, I told my commanding officer that I thought our unit was operating under incorrect intelligence, that we were being given bad information by someone in the chain of command. Nobody wanted to hear it. It was easier to just do the job than to question the orders. I let it go and people died because of it." He paused. I've spent 15 years being angry about that. Don't make the same mistake I did. Don't let this go. I'm not going to, Sarah said. I'm meeting with a journalist from the Washington Post. In a week, I'm going to give her everything I have. Then you're going to need support, Jack said. It wasn't a question. I don't want to drag you into this, Sarah said. It's going to be ugly. There are going to be people who attack me, who question my credibility, who... I already know all that, Jack said. And I'm offering anyway, not because I think it's my job to rescue you. You don't need rescuing, but because you're right, and the right thing to do is to support people who are brave enough to tell the truth. Sarah felt tears prick the back of her eyes. She blinked them away angrily. Okay, she said. Then I'm going to need you to help me get organized. I have a lot of documentation, a lot of interviews, a lot of pieces that don't quite fit together yet. I need someone with a clear head to help me make sense of it all. I can do that, Jack said. When do we start? They left the restaurant early, foregoing dessert. Back at Jack's truck, Sarah made a decision that surprised herself as much as it probably surprised him. She kissed him. It was gentle and tentative and absolutely right. Thank you, she said when they broke apart. For what? Jack asked. Agreeing to help you or for the kiss? Both, Sarah said. Neither, everything. For the next week, they worked. Sarah opened up her apartment to Jack, and he helped her organize all of her documentation into a comprehensive timeline. They printed out copies of emails, laid out photographs, created charts showing the connections between Hartley, Blackridge Solutions, and the terrorist cell. Jack worked with the methodical precision of an engineer, taking Sarah's intuitive conclusions and building logical structures that would help a journalist, or eventually a prosecutor, understand not just that something had happened, but how and why. On Thursday night, the night before Sarah was supposed to meet Linda Vasquez in Topeka, Jack and Sarah sat together in the middle of the apartment floor, surrounded by papers and documentation. Jack was holding a photograph that Sarah had been sent anonymously by a former detainee who had escaped the cell's operations. It showed 3 men in a room with military equipment. One of them was clearly identifiable as the cell's leader. Another was not someone Sarah recognized. And the third was Lieutenant Colonel James Hartley, looking very much alive and very much engaged in a conversation with people he absolutely should not have been associating with. This is the smoking gun, Jack said quietly. Not just a picture, but a picture of him there together with them after he was supposedly not in regular contact. This proves conspiracy. This proves intent. If it's real, Sarah said, she had learned not to be too hopeful. Hopping had disappointed her too many times. It's real, Jack said. He had the certainty in his voice that came from someone with engineering training, someone who understood materials and light and how photographs could be analyzed. I've looked at the metadata. I've examined the background. This is a genuine photograph, probably taken sometime in the last 5 years, definitely taken in a military or government facility. The walls are concrete reinforced with that specific kind of joint pattern. I recognize it because we used similar construction methods in Afghanistan. You can tell all that from a photograph? Sarah asked. I can tell some of it, Jack said, but when you combine what I can tell with what a forensic analyst will be able to tell, and with all the other documentation you've accumulated, it becomes undeniable. He set the photograph down carefully. You're going to win this, Sarah. I'm not going to promise that it's going to be easy, and I'm not going to promise that there aren't going to be people who try to discredit you. But the truth is here, and you have the courage to tell it. The next morning, Sarah drove to Topeka with a folder full of documentation beside her on the passenger seat, and Jack's promise of support in her heart. She had never been more terrified in her life. Linda Vasquez was waiting for her in the hotel conference room. She was a woman in her early 50s, with sharp eyes and the kind of bearing that came from years of interrogating powerful people and not backing down. She shook Sarah's hand firmly and then gestured for her to sit. Tell me everything, Linda said, and don't leave anything out. For the next 4 hours, Sarah laid it all out. She told the journalist about her captivity, about the unusually kind treatment, about the Coca-Cola and the young guard, and the feeling of something being wrong in the narrative that nobody else seemed to notice. She told her about her investigation and the patterns she had found. She told her about the connections between Hartley and the cell leader. She told her about the smuggling operation and the weapons and the terrorist attack in Kabul that had killed 14 people. And she showed her the documentation, the email chains, the photographs, the interview transcripts with former detainees, the military records that showed the suspicious movements and communications, the financial records that traced payments from a defense contractor to shell companies that had direct ties to terrorist organizations. Linda listened. She took notes. She asked questions, hard questions, questions designed to find holes in Sarah's story, questions that made Sarah have to defend her conclusions and her evidence. And slowly, Sarah watched the skepticism fade from the journalist's face and get replaced by something else. Fury. Righteous, controlled fury. "This is real," Linda said finally. "This is genuinely real, and it's a massive story. And if what you're saying is true, there are a lot of people who are going to want to make sure this story never gets told." "I know," Sarah said, "but I'm ready. I've been ready." "No, you haven't," Linda said, not unkindly. "Because you have no idea what's coming. Once this story breaks, your life changes permanently. You'll be harassed. You'll be questioned. People will dig through your personal history looking for anything they can use to discredit you. Your mental health will be examined. Your motives will be questioned. Every mistake you've ever made will become a weapon's argument against you." She paused. "Are you still ready?" Sarah thought about Jack, waiting for her back in Millbrook. She thought about Betty at the Golden Plate, and the teenagers at the library, and all the people who had treated her with kindness, even though they knew nothing about her past. She thought about the 14 people who had died in Kabul. She thought about all the other prisoners held by the cell, the ones who hadn't been as lucky as she had been. The Washington Post ran the story on a Monday morning in May. The headline read, "Defense contractor linked to terrorist financing, military officer accused of smuggling operations." Sarah was sitting in the library, processing returns, when Betty called her on her personal cell phone. "Turn on the news," Betty said without preamble. "Any channel, it's everywhere." By lunchtime, the story had become the lead on every major news network. By evening, it had spread to international news outlets. By the next morning, the FBI had opened a formal investigation. By the end of the week, Lieutenant Colonel James Hartley had been arrested and charged with multiple counts of espionage, weapons trafficking, and conspiracy to provide material support to terrorists. And Sarah Chen had become the story. She was called before Congress. She was interviewed by national news networks. She was profiled in magazines. Her photograph appeared in newspapers across the country. She was hailed as a whistleblower, a hero, a victim who had fought back against corruption and injustice. But she was also attacked. Online message boards filled with people who questioned her credibility, who suggested she had a personal vendetta against Hartley, who wondered aloud why a woman in the military was so obsessed with conspiracy theories. Right-wing news outlets called her a politically motivated false accuser. Left-wing news outlets called her a victim of a military system that had failed her. Everyone had an opinion, and almost none of those opinions mattered to Sarah because what actually mattered was that the truth was out. Hartley's lawyers tried to discredit her. They brought in expert witnesses who questioned her memory of events, her interpretation of photographs, her overall mental stability. But the evidence was too strong, the connections too clear, the documentation too extensive. On a Tuesday evening in June, just 2 months after the story broke, Jack and Sarah sat in the kitchen of her apartment, watching news coverage of Hartley's trial, and Sarah finally allowed herself to cry. "It's going to be okay," Jack said, pulling her close. "He's going to prison, the corruption is being exposed. You won, you actually won." "I know," Sarah said, and the tears kept coming. "I know, but it doesn't feel like winning. It feels like proving that everything I said was right, which means that everything that happened to me was right, which means that I was betrayed by people who were supposed to protect me, which means—" She couldn't finish. The emotions were too big, too complex, too overwhelming. What Sarah was realizing was that winning didn't make the pain of the past go away. It didn't undo her captivity. It didn't give her back the year she had lost to investigation and battles within the military structure. It didn't change the fact that she had been used without her knowledge, that her story had been weaponized without her consent, that people she had trusted had failed her. What winning did do was give meaning to all of that. It transformed her suffering into something that mattered, something that had prevented others from suffering. In July, Sarah received a formal apology from the United States military. In August, she received a settlement from the military for her wrongful discharge and mistreatment. In September, her former commanding officers began to face their own investigations. In October, Hartley was convicted and sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. By November, Sarah's face was finally starting to fade from the news cycle. The story had broken. The investigation had concluded. The sentencing had been handed down. There was nothing left to report, so slowly, the cameras and the reporters and the public attention began to drift away to the next scandal, the next crisis, the next story. And Sarah found herself facing something she hadn't expected to have to navigate: peace. She had spent so long fighting, so long investigating, so long pushing for justice, that she hadn't stopped to think about what she would do when that fight was over. She had a military pension that was actually quite comfortable now that she wasn't being discharged. She had job offers from think tanks and defense contractors and universities. She had people reaching out who wanted to hire her, interview her, use her story. But what Sarah actually wanted was something much simpler. She wanted to stay in Millbrook. She wanted to keep working at the library. She wanted to continue having breakfast with Betty at the Golden Plate. She wanted to keep seeing Jack Mueller, who had been remarkably patient about the fact that their romantic relationship had been overshadowed by a federal investigation and a very public trial. "You deserve to have a rest," Jack had said when she mentioned it to him. "You deserve to just be a person for a while, not a symbol or a victim or a war hero. You deserve to be boring." "I'm not sure I know how to be boring," Sarah had said. "Then I guess I'll have to teach you," Jack had replied. On a Saturday morning in November, Sarah sat at a table in the Golden Plate with Betty, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper. A paper newspaper, which she had started doing again, having discovered that she liked the physical sensation of turning pages and circling interesting articles. "There's a Thanksgiving potluck at the community center," Betty was saying. "The library is helping coordinate. I thought maybe you'd be interested in helping out. I know you've been through a lot, but you're part of the community now, and the community does holidays together." "I'd like that," Sarah said, and meant it, a community potluck, the most ordinary, peaceful thing she could imagine. "Good," Betty said, looking satisfied. She paused, then added, "Also, Jack told me you two have been seeing each other. I'm very glad about that. He needed someone who understood what it's like to come back from war, and you needed someone who wasn't going to be intimidated by your strength." Sarah smiled. "He told you that?" "He told me in the way that men like Jack tell you things," Betty said. "Which is to say, he was trying very hard to act casual about it while being very obviously uncasual." They were laughing when a young man entered the diner. He looked to be in his late 20s, with the bearing of someone who had served or was currently serving in the military. He looked nervous, like he was looking for something. His eyes scanned the diner and landed on Sarah. "Are you Captain Sarah Chen?" he asked, coming over to her table. Sarah's entire body went tense. It had been weeks since a stranger had approached her, and even though she knew that the investigation was over, that the case was closed, there was still a part of her that was braced for attack or threat. "I am," she said carefully. "My name is David Torres," the young man said. "I served under the command of people who were connected to James Hartley's operations. I was in Kabul when the attack happened. I lost 2 friends that day, and I wanted to thank you for telling the truth, for making sure that what happened wasn't ignored." His voice was steady, but his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "My friends' families finally have an explanation for why they died, finally have justice. I came here specifically to tell you that your story mattered." Sarah felt Betty's hand slip into hers under the table. She looked at David Torres, this young man who had carried grief and confusion for years, and she finally understood what victory actually meant. "I'm glad," she said softly. "I'm very glad." After David left the diner, Sarah sat in silence for a moment. Betty squeezed her hand but didn't speak. Sometimes, Sarah was learning, there were no words for the moment when your sacrifice transformed into something that actually helped the world. That evening, Sarah and Jack went to dinner at Marcello's again. It had become their place, the place where they had told each other important truths. Jack brought her a small box as dessert was being cleared away. "I wasn't planning this," he said. "I don't have a big dramatic moment planned, but I don't think I should wait for one." Inside the box was a simple diamond ring. "I love you. I love your strength and your courage and your capacity to care about justice even when it would have been easier to just let it go. Will you marry me?" Sarah said yes. She said it with certainty and without hesitation, and she cried again, but this time the tears were the good kind. The kind that meant she had finally found her way home. The wedding took place on a Saturday in March in the community church of Millbrook. It was small and simple. Sarah's parents came from California. Betty was Sarah's matron of honor. Jack's brother, who lived in Colorado, was his best man. About 100 people from the town attended. The ceremony took place in the afternoon, and the reception was held at the Golden Plate, which Betty closed for the evening specifically for the event. Sarah wore a simple white dress, not a traditional wedding gown, but something elegant and appropriate for a second marriage between two people who had both already lived full lives. Jack wore a suit, and when Sarah walked down the aisle, walked it herself, having declined her father's offer to give her away, she felt a sense of peace that she hadn't felt since before her first tour in Iraq. They danced to a recording of a jazz standards album. They cut a cake that Betty had made. They thanked the people who had supported them. And by the end of the evening, Sarah was Mrs. Sarah Mueller, and she had something she had never thought she would have again, a future that felt manageable and quiet and full of small joys. But then, in April, something unexpected happened. Sarah received a phone call from Linda Vasquez. The journalist sounded excited and energized in a way she hadn't sounded in months. "I've been following up on some threads from the Hartley case," Linda said without preamble. "Looking into the money trails, trying to figure out exactly how deep the corruption went. And I found something that I think you need to know about. Are you sitting down?" "I'm in my apartment," Sarah said. "Sitting down, Jack is here too. I'm going to put you on speaker." "Okay," Linda said. "So, you know how Hartley's communications seemed to stop about 6 months after your captivity? How you never figured out why he had suddenly become more careful about how he was contacting the cell?" "Yes," Sarah said. "It was one of the things that didn't quite make sense." "I think I know why," Linda said. "There was someone else involved in the operation, someone higher up in the chain of command than Hartley, someone who Hartley was answering to. And when that person realized that Hartley was getting sloppy, that he was leaving evidence of his communications, they effectively put Hartley on house arrest, communication-wise, to minimize their own exposure. Hartley was the visible connection to the illegal operations, but he wasn't the mastermind." Sarah felt her stomach clench. She had thought this was over. She had thought they had gotten everyone involved. "Who?" she asked. "Who was directing him?" "I'm still investigating," Linda said. "But I'm pretty sure it was someone at the Pentagon. Someone with access to military personnel records, someone who could manipulate assignments, someone who could make complaints disappear from the official record. Someone who was using their position to facilitate weapons trafficking." "Jesus," Jack said softly. "I know," Linda said. "I know this isn't what you wanted. I know you thought this was finished. But I wouldn't tell you if I wasn't sure about this. And I need your help to figure out the rest of it." Sarah felt something inside her crystallize. She had just started to believe that she could move on. She had just started to build a life with Jack. She had just started to be at peace. And now the investigation was expanding into something larger and more complicated. "What do you need?" she asked. "I need you to help me identify the people at the Pentagon who had access to the right systems," Linda said. "I need you to help me understand the chain of command from Hartley's perspective. I need you to help me build a case that will stand up to scrutiny. I know I'm asking a lot, and I know that you've already given enough, but the people who are behind this are still in positions of power. They're still making decisions that affect the military. And I really think you're the only person who can help me expose them." Sarah looked at Jack. His face was serious, but he was nodding. He had been through this with her once. He knew what she had to do. "Okay," Sarah said. "I'll help you, but I'm going to need some conditions." "Name them," Linda said. "I want this done right," Sarah said. "I want you to build the strongest possible case. I don't want there to be any ambiguity, any possibility that these people can slither out of responsibility, and I want it to happen quickly. I've given enough of my life to this investigation. I'm not going to spend another year chasing shadows." "I can work with that," Linda said. "Can we set up a meeting, same hotel in Topeka?" The meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks later. In the interim, Sarah dove back into research with a focus she hadn't felt in months. She had thought the main case had activated every investigative instinct she had, but as she began to trace the higher-level connections, she realized that what she had done before was just scratching the surface. The person Linda had identified as the potential mastermind was a deputy director at the Pentagon, a man named General Robert Cushman, who had been in his position for 8 years, and was being groomed for promotion to full director of defense intelligence. He had the right access. He had the right connections. He had the right motivation. Defense contractors paid extraordinarily well for people who could help them secure weapons contracts. But proving it was going to be different than proving Hartley's involvement. Hartley had been sloppy. He had left trails of evidence. Cushman, if he was involved, had been careful. Everything was deniable. Everything could be explained away. Sarah spent 2 weeks in her apartment, Jack watching from the sidelines with a mixture of concern and resignation. He had known this was coming. He had known that the moment they found another layer to the corruption, Sarah would have to pursue it. "I'm sorry," she told him one evening. "Don't be," Jack said. "This is who you are. This is what you do. You find truth and you expose it. I accepted that about you when I proposed. But I'm also going to ask you to remember something. There's a difference between being a soldier and being self-destructive. Make sure you're not tipping into the second thing." Sarah nodded. She understood what he was saying. She also understood that she might not be able to stop until she had gotten every single person responsible for the corruption. When she met with Linda in Topeka, she brought with her a new document. It was a record she had painstakingly reconstructed from memory, cross-referenced with publicly available military records. It detailed every assignment she had ever received, every command change, every personnel decision that had affected her trajectory in the military. And when you laid them out chronologically and compared them to Cushman's tenure in his position, a pattern emerged. Every time Sarah had gotten close to finding evidence of corruption, she had been reassigned. Every time she had threatened to escalate a complaint, her paperwork had been lost or misfiled. Every time she might have threatened the operation, she had been moved to a new posting in a different location. Cushman hadn't just been backing Hartley. Cushman had been controlling the entire operation. Hartley had been the face of it, but Cushman had been the architect. "This is extraordinary," Linda said, studying Sarah's reconstruction. "This is going to require very careful corroboration, but if we can tie these pieces together." She trailed off, then looked at Sarah. "This is going to be bigger than Hartley's case. This is going to implicate the entire military intelligence community. Are you absolutely sure you want to do this?" Sarah thought about David Torres. She thought about the young man's 2 dead friends. She thought about all the other people who had been harmed by the corruption that Cushman had been protecting and facilitating. The investigation into General Robert Cushman took 8 months. It was meticulous, careful work that required Sarah to coordinate with Linda, with the FBI, with military investigators, and with the Department of Justice. Multiple times, people warned her that she should consider just letting it go, that taking on someone of Cushman's rank was dangerous, that she had already accomplished what most whistleblowers could only dream of. But Sarah kept going. She did it not because she wanted revenge. She did it not because she enjoyed the fight. She did it because she understood in the deepest part of her being that justice delayed was justice denied. In December, federal agents arrested General Robert Cushman at his home in Arlington, Virginia. The charges were extensive: conspiracy to commit espionage, weapons trafficking, embezzlement, abuse of power, and a dozen other federal crimes. The arrest made international news because of how high it went, because it represented not just corruption but a fundamental breach of the public trust. Cushman's lawyers tried everything. They challenged the evidence. They claimed that Sarah was a disgruntled former officer seeking revenge. They tried to claim that the military intelligence community had conspired against their client because he was unpopular in certain circles. But the evidence was overwhelming. The documentation was undeniable. The testimony from subordinates who had been forced to participate in the cover-ups was detailed and credible. In February, a year after Sarah's initial story had broken, Cushman agreed to a plea deal. He would admit to conspiracy, weapons trafficking, and abuse of power. In exchange, the government would not pursue the espionage charges, which could have resulted in a life sentence. Cushman was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Sarah watched the sentencing from the courthouse gallery. Jack sat beside her, his hand in hers. When the judge announced the verdict, Sarah felt something inside her release. Not healing, exactly, not forgiveness, but a letting go of something that had been poisoning her. After the sentencing, Linda Vasquez met Sarah and Jack in the hallway of the courthouse. The journalist was beaming. "You did it," Linda said. "You actually did it. You took on the entire military establishment and you won. Do you realize how rare that is?" "I didn't do it alone," Sarah said, looking at Jack and then at Linda. "I had help. I had people who believed me." "People believe you because you told the truth," Linda said, "and because you had the courage to keep pursuing it even when it would have been easier to just move on with your life." She paused. "I'm writing a book about this whole thing, about your investigation, about the case, about what it means for military intelligence and defense contracting in this country. I want you to be fully involved in it. Would you be interested?" Sarah looked at Jack. He nodded slightly, giving her permission to make her own choice without his input. "Yes," Sarah said, "but I have one condition. I want the proceeds from the book to go to a foundation. A foundation for former military personnel who have experienced mistreatment or cover-ups by the military establishment. I want to create a resource for other whistleblowers." "That's the most Sarah Chen thing I've ever heard," Linda said, smiling. "Okay, we're going to do that." Over the next year, Sarah worked with Linda on the book. She gave interviews. She relived difficult moments. She shared her story with a level of detail and honesty that she probably wouldn't have thought possible a few years earlier. The process was painful, but it was also cathartic. By the time the book was published, Sarah felt like she had truly processed what she had been through. The book became a bestseller. Military personnel came forward with their own stories. Other whistleblowers found courage through Sarah's example, and slowly the military's approach to handling complaints and cover-ups began to change. Not overnight, not perfectly, but noticeably. On a warm afternoon in June, more than a year after Cushman's conviction, Sarah sat in a small community room at the library in Millbrook. About 30 people were gathered: current military personnel on leave, veterans, family members of service members. They had organized themselves into a peer support group for people dealing with military injustice. Sarah was there to give a talk. "I'm not going to tell you that fighting for justice is easy," Sarah said, looking at the faces in the room. "I'm going to tell you that it's necessary. I'm going to tell you that if you see something wrong, you have a responsibility to say something. And I'm going to tell you that even if you're dismissed the first time you speak up, that doesn't mean you stop. That doesn't mean the truth isn't important." She paused, looking for David Torres in the crowd. He was there, as he always was at these meetings. "I'm going to tell you that your sacrifice matters, that the people who died because of the corruption that I exposed, they're remembered. Their families have justice. And that only happened because multiple people were brave enough to tell the truth, even when it cost them something to do it." After the talk, people came up to Sarah to share their own stories. A woman who had been harassed and then pushed out of her position. A man who had witnessed accounting fraud and had been blacklisted for reporting it. A young officer who was considering coming forward about something she had witnessed. Sarah listened to all of them. She gave them the contact information for the foundation. She offered advice based on her own experience. And she realized, somewhere in the midst of all these conversations, that this was what she was meant to do. Not fight Hartley and Cushman, though that had been necessary, but help other people find their voice. Help other people understand that their truth mattered. That evening, Sarah sat on the porch of the small house that she and Jack had bought together, just outside of Millbrook. From the porch, you could see the town spread out below, peaceful and small and full of ordinary people living ordinary lives. "You did a good thing today," Jack said, bringing her a cup of tea. "I just talked," Sarah said. "The people in that room, they're the ones doing the brave thing. They're the ones willing to risk their careers, their reputations, for the truth." "But you gave them permission," Jack said. "You showed them that it was possible. That's just as important as the risk they're taking." Jack settled into the chair beside hers, and they sat together in the growing darkness, watching the lights of Millbrook twinkle below them. Sarah thought about how far she had come. From a prisoner held in a basement in Iraq, to a soldier dismissed by the military establishment, to a whistleblower whose case had exposed corruption at the highest levels. But more than that, she thought about how far she had come as a person. From someone who felt like she had to do everything alone, to someone who understood that strength wasn't about fighting every battle by yourself. That strength was knowing when to ask for help. That strength was building connections with other people who shared your values. Her phone buzzed. A text from Linda Vasquez. The foundation that Sarah had established had just received its first round of funding. Enough to hire a legal consultant and establish a website and support system. Enough to actually help people. Sarah shared the news with Jack and he hugged her. "That's incredible," he said. "You should be so proud." "I'm proud of us," Sarah said. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." 3 years after she had first arrived in Millbrook, Sarah's life had transformed in ways she never could have predicted. She wasn't military anymore, but she had found a different kind of purpose. She wasn't fighting a war, but she was fighting for something that mattered, for truth, for justice, for the belief that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they were willing to take a stand. The story of Captain Sarah Chen and her fight against military corruption had taken on a life of its own. Universities taught her case as an example of whistleblowing and institutional change. Military academies discussed the lessons of her experience. Young officers came up to her and told her that she was the reason they had decided to stay in the service, to fight from the inside to create change. But what Sarah treasured most wasn't the national recognition, or the book deals, or the speaking engagements. What she treasured most was the simple fact that she could sit on her porch on a warm evening with the man she loved, in a town that had become her home, knowing that she had fought for what was right, and that good had come from it. She had been a prisoner, she had been dismissed, she had been disgraced and discharged, but she had also been strong enough to refuse to accept injustice. She had been brave enough to keep fighting when everyone told her to give up. She had been wise enough to accept help and build connections and understand that strength wasn't about going it alone. That was the true story, not just about corruption and cover-ups, but about a woman who refused to be broken by circumstance, about a woman who transformed her pain into purpose, about a woman who understood that sometimes justice isn't served quickly or easily, but when you're willing to do the work, when you're willing to stand up and tell the truth, it can be served. Sarah Chen had earned her justice. Now she was helping others earn theirs. And in a small Kansas town, where not much ever happened and nobody expected anything extraordinary, an extraordinary woman had built an extraordinary life, not in spite of her suffering, but because she had refused to let that suffering be meaningless. That was the real twist. That was the real victory, not revenge or exposure or vindication, though those had all happened, but transformation. Personal transformation that rippled outward to change the institution she had served and to inspire others to be brave. The sun set over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. Sarah sipped her tea. Jack held her hand. And in that moment, in that peace, Sarah finally felt like she had come home.